So how you doing?
Password 123.
No, I miss those days when we used to be a little company from Montreal at AK. Yeah, we didn't have security rules back then. So yeah, as I said, greetings. Nice to be in front, like for the first time. I've been coming to these events since the beginning. So I'm glad to contribute. And yeah, optimizing audio for games is the title of the presentation I want to give. It is subtitled Audiokinetic Interactive Audio Montreal because, you know, the words go well together. Max is right. It's not a sponsored talk. Like, I've built the slide deck like after my work hours, and I'm not paid right now. So yeah. But let's start by introducing me a bit more. So in more detail, my position is the lead of AK support team. I'm also a certified WISE trainer and sometimes have the chance to give trainings to teams who buy them from us. But yeah, more specifically, stuff that is not on the slide that you want to know about me is I like science and technology a lot. And I also like people a lot. And I'm a firm believer that if technology is not understood by some people, it's completely useless. And I mean, there's many examples of that, technologies that were invented, nobody understood, and they just went away. And yeah, and what I do, what I'm good at and what I like to do in life is explain technology to people so they can get it and do crazy stuff with it. Yeah, because what I'm not is I'm not a creative person. I've never done a video game. Like, I've helped people since 2014 ship their video games when they get some problems with audio. But yeah, I never had the experience of, you know, working in a game studio, and so I had the imposter syndrome for a long time. I remember my first time here, I'm like, oh, it's a game audio thing? Well, maybe they won't know, like I'm not really a real guy. So yeah, this is my small tip to the newcomers, their first time. And if you didn't know already, you are all game audio, like at least like right now, because you're listening to me talk. And that's all it takes. Now that I've established that I'm a very knowledgeable person, I will start with a quote because I like people and I like smart people, even if they're dead. So, well, all the good quotes are from dead people. So Socrates had this very great quote. Well, it's some version translation of a thing he said. What I really like about that is I like the humility about it. Like, it doesn't matter how much knowledge you've accumulated and experience and all that. It's good to remind yourself there's always something new to learn, and nobody knows everything. And yeah, and the key is to stay curious, to understand more. And I put this up here right now because this is my hope and my goal for tonight, that at least everyone here will come out understanding maybe some detail a bit better. So, enough set up the plan for the presentation. It goes like this. So we're almost done with the first part, the intro. So optimizing audio for games. I want to talk about memory and how your audio impacts memory. And I want to talk about central processing units or CPUs, and so how you have to think about them to, save as much CPU as you can during the course of your work designing games and audio for games. So, first part, let's start with memory. There's two types of memory that we care about, let's say. Storage memory and working memory, I would call them. So storage is classically optical disk, more recently hard disk, and maybe even the cloud. So where you store files for a long time and let them sleep. Working memory is also called random access memory in computer terms. It's usually some device next to your CPU that the CPU needs and uses to transform data, basically. Right, but that's it. So, but before we start using memory to store our sounds, we must first encode it. So let's talk about encoding audio to a digital format. So I'd like to give a shout out to Cadence website for having such a great picture that I could borrow. Right, so encoding audio to digital format is, in its simplest form, just translating an analog waveform, so the nice green sine wave there, into a series of ones and zeros, and that's what our red digital line represents there. So each digital sample is a representation of the amplitude of the signal at that time. I told you about them. I like smart dead people. So Nyquist Shannon. So it's a very loaded slide with lots of words. So the best thing I can say about all this is two things. Wikipedia is great. But all joking aside, so the first one is like the big Nyquist-Shannon principle, and then I put like I was trying to figure out the difference, like what did Nyquist and Shannon say differently or the same? So my conclusion is Nyquist went more from like analog standpoint and Shannon was more digital side, but they are all both saying the same thing, which is this, basically. So the key takeaway from these smart dead people is when you're digitizing audio, the thing you have to keep in mind is your sampling frequency has to be at least twice the maximum frequency you want to capture digitally. I considered for a bit like to do something on aliasing, like the bad thing that's going to happen if you don't do that, but it's heavy. But as I said, Wikipedia is great and it's available to everyone. So if you want to dive into aliasing and all that stuff, it exists. Anyway, I will talk about parts of it, let's say. Okay, let's move on. And I want to show you a short sound. That's like less like 0.4 seconds of vowels, I would say. So maybe you're used to seeing this. So that's the representation, amplitude of a sound over time. If we zoom into a small section, Audacity is nice enough to show me like actual discrete samples. So, but yeah, and since this is a 44.1 kilohertz sample sound, that gives me intervals of 22.7 microseconds, yes. So a sound over time, amplitude over time looks like this. But as you know, we also, well, I'm talking about sampling frequencies and all that, and in sound, it's also often useful to look at our sounds in a spectral format. So that's the exact same sound in a spectral form. So it's difficult because you would really need, you want a three-dimensional graph to represent frequency over time. But yeah, basically the trick is the brighter the color, the higher the energy. And yeah, and we can see this is a voiced sound, so everything is below 8, even 5 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz. So yeah, the most important information is there. And looking at this sound, you can see at the top in the y-axis being the frequencies, of course. Either the sound was sampled at 30 kilohertz at some time, or some other filtering happened because there's nothing about 15 kilohertz there. That makes sense, right? So yeah, typical sampling frequencies, CD format or yeah, 44.1. Oh yeah, it's true, I have to mention it now. Wise uses 48 kilohertz and I often see 96K, maybe even up to 192 kilohertz recording. But yeah, since we all know now that the maximum frequency we can encode is half our sampling frequency, so that gives us, okay, we get 22 or 24 or even up to 48 kilohertz of resolution, or yeah, encoding. But why would someone like encode above 40 kilohertz, since we know that the human ear will never hear stuff above 20 kilohertz? I mean, even 20 kilohertz, you have to be a brand new kid and with no trauma to your eardrums to be able to pick that up. So the only reason you would sample that high is when you want to slow down the playback afterwards. So if you slow down a 96 kilohertz sample file to half the speed, you still retain half the frequency resolution up to 24K, so way beyond what we can perceive, so it's good. But yeah, we may come back on this topic on CPU part, but yeah, sometimes you choose your sampling rate, or you get your files, they're sampled at something, but once you convert them to put them in the game, you have to make this decision, what sampling rate am I using in the game? So I'll get back to this topic. Right. So that was like the actual technical class part of the presentation. The rest is a bit more, I would say, informational, or also I have to give credit to my colleague Mathieu Jean, who wrote a great blog post recently called A Guide for Choosing the Right Codec. So most of the information there, you don't need to take notes and even ask Max about the recording. There's a great blog post where I ripped all this information. All right, so let's start. Audio encoding for games. So starting from the most basic, or it's not even a codec, some would say, pulse code modulation. So simple, it's basically just what I showed you in the waveform format with the samples. If those samples are over 16 bits, that's it. So you get the full frequency spectrum, whatever it is, and you use 16-bit at every 22.7 microseconds to encode. It's great because it costs no CPU, to decode. The cost of CPU for moving it around and playing it is the same for all, but yeah, you don't need CPU to decode it, you just need to copy it and play it. But the biggest drawback, it's going to take the most space on your hard disk, and when you load it in memory, it will also take a lot of space. So engineers got to work and came up with a step up from pulse code modulation, and it's what we call adaptive differential pulse code modulation. So it will give you like up to, or I think, approximately 4 times the compression. So a PCM file, the same file encoded in PCM is a quarter of the size, or approximately. So great for saving some storage space, and without having to think about investing a lot of CPU. Like, you don't need to budget CPU for a DPCM at runtime. There is a CPU cost, but it's trivial, I would say. Well, especially when we're going to move on to the next one. So very low CPU cost, but a moderate, I would say, memory cost. The other thing, ADPCM, it's some content like high transient, like very quickly changing sounds, or sounds with a lot of high frequency content. Encoding to ADPCM will be noticeable. But then again, it's your mileage may vary. That's a good thing to experiment with. Like, some sounds you will never tell the difference. So it's always a good idea to try it. Next up is Vorbis. So perceptual encoding. That's where I was saying earlier, PCM is just straight up like, it's going to encode whatever frequency content you have and there's no tricks there. Perceptual encoding is based on human hearing. We know the human ear does not hear perfectly at full volume all frequency ranges. In our 20 to 20 hertz, there's like a shape, an envelope of frequencies we hear better, and some we hear not as well, like human voice. We're very well tuned for it, but some sounds are less important and we don't perceive as much. But using this known shared shape of hearing that every humans use, that makes a lot of data that doesn't need to be encoded. So that's what perceptual encoding means. Right, and Vorbis was first introduced as an alternative because at the time, all the good perceptual codecs, like the good codecs that give you good quality and good compression, were all proprietary. So yeah, thank you, Vorbis. So Vorbis, the drawback is it has a high CPU cost when you decode it, but it's very light on memory. But notice that I said previously very low and high. I mean, there's no middle ground, and it's like a big step up from. And now, if you're using Vorbis, then you need maybe a CPU budget, or if you plan to have many voices at once, it's gonna start showing. Let's say. Well, I say this. I mean, it depends of the context, the game. Like some games are, I don't know, have tons of resource, they never care about it. Some other, the audio team gets very little. You could tell me more about that, but yeah, let's say my job is to help solve problems, I hear more about we don't have memory or we don't have CPU type of things. But yes, and I didn't comment, so ADPCM, I said it gives you about 4 times compression compared to uncompressed PCM. With Vorbis, you can go from 1.5 to 3 times more. So 1.54 is, anyway. So anyway, it's a big gain in compression compared to a DPCM, and there's no warnings about audible artifacts and all that. Oh, also, I think Mathieu mentions it in his blog, but he mentions it to me all the time. And yeah, I'm going to talk about Wise now. Because Wise Vorbis is not the same Vorbis you find on the internet. Open source Vorbis, that is available to anybody, is what is used, I believe, in Fmod and in Unreal. But Audiokinetic has iterated many times optimizing Vorbis for games because it was made as a musical format. So it wasn't made to be compact, and there was some stuff like preparation before it can be decoded that we chopped down, or anyway, optimize to the max. So our Audiokinetic's Vorbis is very much optimized for real-time use and incompatible with the reference, let's say. So yeah, but what Mathieu tells me all the time, so it goes, we have a quality factor for perceptual encoders. It's a common thing. That's how you can tune like the parameters of the encoder to take more space or less, but then at maybe the cost of, it's always the same. You reduce quality, you're gonna get more compression, but possibly audible audio quality loss, I would say. If you're using Vorbis in Wise, quality 4 is like the sweet spot. Like from many tests we did, even a very acute ear cannot tell the difference between quality 4 and 10. When you start going down from 4, then it becomes noticeable, but yeah. That's the takeaway from the Wise users in the room. Vorbis quality 4 is very good. Okay, moving on. The newcomer and, well, yeah, the superstar of audio codecs is Opus. It has many things in common with Vorbis. It's open source, it's a perceptual encoder. But yeah, it's basically an iteration on the, I think there's a few people. I know a guy that was involved in Vorbis, that was also involved in Opus. Anyway, so a specialist in, and he's more in the narrowband voice coding section. But yeah, Opus has that. So the very specialized encoder below 8 kilohertz for human voice. But it also adds something that wasn't there before. It's mindful of higher frequency content, especially for music. So it's tuned for music and voice. So that's why I say it's pretty much the best. And yeah, top of the line, latest all developments and research were leveraged to create it. So why do I tell you about the other ones if Opus is so good, right? Well, it comes with the very, very high CPU cost. And it's not, I don't know if we plan to optimize it, but yeah, it has this thing where there's a fixed cost for Opus where there's 80 milliseconds of file that is just, it's called pre-roll, just to get the decoder ramped up. So during that time, you're not outputting audio yet. We can do it not real time, so it doesn't take 80 milliseconds, but that means for very short sounds, it's a high overhead to pay, and it's a high CPU codec, so not short sounds, I would say. But I'll get into more details of what codecs for what sounds you should use a bit later on. So, but Opus fights back against his drawback of high CPU cost, by being featured in hardware decoders. So that's when some devices, I will name names, Xbox Series X, PS5, and the Switch have dedicated a hardware that can decode Opus. And that's because of the high CPU cost, so you can use Opus and, in theory, not care about the high CPU cost. The keyword there was in theory. Okay, moving to the dark stuff of Xbox past. XMA. Right, as you can see, there's some baggage there. It's only on Xbox platform, and it's there for legacy reasons now. It was preferred for 360 and Xbox One, but I'm not even sure they have it on Series S. Anyway, it's there on Series S and X at least, so you can run an Xbox One game that used XMA without having to redo the game. But they copy-pasted the XMA decoder from Xbox One to XSX with no change. You will see that later. And XMA comes with some limitations. It does not. It doesn't support sample accurate stitching. In some conditions it does, but you have to, you need to respect some lengths and whatever. So all kinds of limitations that are written in the data sheets, but people only learn about it when they contact me because they're not happy because they didn't read the docs in advance. Anyway, so. And my colleague Mathieu Jean, who is like our Microsoft guy, he went to XFest and told all the Microsoft developers never use XMA anymore because it was when Opus was available. Yeah, that's the only codec I've had like a sound sent to me by a customer. We encode it to XMA and WISE, we run it, and not only did it crash like the game, it bricked, like the chip, the decoding chip, the hardware chip was bricked. The only way you can get out of that is power down the console. Well, there's probably maybe some command down there we could reset the DSP, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's the most fatal audio bug I've ever experienced in my life. And and that was my first year at AKN. I'm like, okay, I don't like XMA. So. Stuff I like though, being a Sony employee now, is A-Track. So A-Track stands for Adaptive Transform Acoustic Coding. It's only available on PlayStation platform. It was developed by Sony back when I was a teenager, dreaming to get enough money to buy a mini disc, but never got around to it. But yeah, so it was made for mini disc, so they needed some digital format for their new thing. They have since, a bit like us with Vorbis, did many optimization passes on it, especially to get to a track 9, where they remade it specifically for games, so for high compression and yeah, optimized for games. Let's look at all of them in a beautiful table. That's from the article of Mathieu. So as I said, gives you the comparison of compression ratio you can expect. So nothing for PCM, 4 times for ADPCM. And then all the other ones, it will depend what's the content and yeah, and the higher, like 40-to-1 for Vorbis and 60-to-1 for Opus, it's more theoretical. Nobody can reach really that in real life. And then you can see the, yeah, and the variable bitrate of Vorbis, it's not like variable, it always outputs at the same bitrate. It's more how many bits does it, if you have a piece of silence to encode, it's going to save bits. It's going to use very little bits to encode, and then a very busy, noisy part, it can use more bits for that. So that's what it means, the variable or constant. Right. So yeah, and Vorbis and Opus are very comparable, apart from the fact that Opus is newer, more tuned for music and voice, and can reach higher compressions. Now, moving on to sound categories and when do we want to use each of these. Starting with voiceovers, since we usually have a lot of them, PCM is not very appropriate. So Opus is the best. So if you have thousands and thousands of lines, you're really going to like the high compression of Opus with no quality loss. And then either you leverage, well, you always leverage hardware decoding when you can. But also for voiceovers, it's recommended because you rarely have like so many of them at one time. So you're decoding 2, maybe 3 max at once. So even if it's a high CPU cost, it's still not that much. Or it's mitigated by that fact. Next, sounds, impacts, and short granular sounds. Since they're often played and they often require to be stitching, they're awful in XMA. So Vorbis would be the best if you have the CPU budget for it. But yeah, because doing it in Opus, that would be overkill, and the shortness of it, there's the pre-roll overhead I was talking about. So Vorbis is the best choice. But yeah, if CPU budget becomes tight, you could use ADPCM. CPU budgets rarely come tight, like on PC and consoles. That's more when you have a successful game that you then decide that you're going to port on a Switch. That's where you face this type of challenge, and maybe you choose ADPCM. For more general sound effects and ambience, they are longer. If you can use hardware decoding, that's good. And Vorbis when you can't. And actually, for a PlayStation 5, it's Vorbis because there's hardware decoding of Vorbis on PS5. If CPU budget is tight, yeah, it's always fall back to ADPCM. Music is Opus. The only thing to say is don't mix hardware and software, especially for music. If you want your tracks to be synchronized, so if you have a software and hardware track that needs to be synchronized, maybe, but as soon as you get some load on the system, that's where things could go wrong. So avoid mixing them. And if Opus is not possible, then Vorbis. Right. And this is kind of the conclusion of part 1 of memory. So when we're playing a sound, or when we ask our friendly sound engine to play a sound, it finds the audio data, either in its working memory and it's ready to go, or in storage and he transfers it to memory to be ready to go. Next step, it's going to be decoded and it's written to some memory buffer to pass on down the voice pipeline. And if it's, and then it gets mixed with all voices, and at the final part of the voice pipeline where all gets mixed together, it's written to an output memory buffer. And yeah, and that is done in a typical voice project 48,000 times a second. So, bringing us slowly but surely to part 2, the CPU. But yeah, after all this data, I'm gonna bring back another dead dude, Mr. John von Neumann. Well, you can't really talk about CPUs without talking about John von Neumann. So yeah, I like the quote. It's not super important, but it's about, humility and curiosity again, I think. But yeah, why John von Neumann? Because he's the creator of this von Neumann architecture, which is the basis of all the CPU cores in this machine, in my phone, and in every device you have around you. Over the years, of course, that's a simplified diagram, but that's the basic design that is just optimized in different parts, and that's it. And recently, the biggest innovation is making multiple cores work as one. So parallelizing software development, but it's still down to the hardware. It's always some input device, the central processing unit as control, and ALU, or arithmetic and logic unit, that crunches the stuff, the memory, it needs to work, and at one point it's going to give you a transformed data at the output. So CPU? Oh wait, it's the same slide, Guillaume. Yes, but as my skills in making words bold, it's the same slide. It's just I'm highlighting it here. Is that a question?
With all the sounds outside, can you talk a little bit louder, please?
I will certainly try.
Thank you.
But there's room in front too. Yeah. But yeah.
A lot of room up front.
So, same slide. But yeah, I'm just highlighting these are more the CPU responsibilities in this process. So the finding of the audio, any code that's execute has to go through the CPU. So finding the audio data, is it on disk or is it already in memory? Thank you, CPU. Decoding, CPU is gonna do that for you. Mixing, again, our good friend, the CPU. So yeah, finding the audio data. If it's already loaded, it plays. If not, it's streamed to memory. And then let's say you want the best of both worlds. You want your sounds to be ready to play, but you don't want to use up all your working memory, holding the sounds there ready to play. That's where some zero latency can be used. But yeah. So zero latency, you have the beginning of the sound is kept in memory. So when it has to be played, it's ready to go. But when that happens, it also starts fetching the rest of the sound from the storage to be ready. So back in optical disc days, when you played a sound and you had to spin up the disc and send it, this was very important. And how much length of prefetch, or how much time before, length of sound you want to store in actual memory used to be a lot bigger. In this day and age with the modern hard disk, especially SSDs, it's becoming a thing of the past, I would say. But yeah, finding the audio, and the goal is to get it to memory to be ready to play. Then every time it plays, it's decoded. So yeah, I say unless load and decode is used. So that's a feature we did for at a user's request. So they wanted to make their game using Vorbis because it was a mobile game. So Vorbis is great. It's going to compress a lot, so they can have a smaller app, and people can download quickly and easily. But then the problem with Vorbis is high CPU costs. So when you play these Vorbis sounds on weak mobile devices, CPU becomes a thing. So they asked us, could we have something where when we load the sound, it gets decoded at that time, and it's loaded as PCM, and then, so they pay the decode once. And yeah, and for a mobile game, when you're running the game, it made sense. It's a good idea. Like you have your RAM is used for the game, so you could store PCM sounds, and yeah. So that's load and decode. Hardware, when you have a sound that needs to be hardware decoded, that's where it gets sent to the specialized device. But yeah, the CPU is the maestro. It's coordinating all the transfer and all that. Sometimes there's bugs in this process, so test early a lot. And yeah, as I say, get to know the limitations of the hardware decoder for each platform early. Yeah, because yeah, it's been my experience getting like people angry trying to ship their game. They're having this problem. I'm like, are you using XMA? And they say yes. And I didn't plan like to be bashing XMA so much, but it's more. Don't worry. Right, and finally, the end of decoding is. Yes, let's say the sound was 44.1, and your sound engine is running at 48 kilohertz. So we have to translate it to the 48 kilohertz at that point. So that's what I was saying. I'd get back to the choosing your sampling right. You can have like whatever sampling rate in your source waves, but yeah, in Wise, when you convert them, you can say, oh, keep my sampling rate as input because I really like my 44.1, so it's going to be encoded 44.1, loaded like that, and when you get to play, oh, we have to pay a small, it's very light, but yeah, you have to use your CPU to just translate the rate of the samples to the native sound engines. So that's why my recommendation here is, and that's about knowing your platforms. If you know you'll be using a sound engine that's running at 48K, you should convert your sounds to that same matching frequency. Moving on. Last step of our CPU playing a sound is the mixing. Right. It's where the greatest gain, but not actually it's not optimizing the mixing. And yeah, that's the biggest, greatest takeaway of optimizing audio for your game I can give you is control your voices. Put voice limits where you need them, and that is the golden rule is to limit your number of voices. And yeah, I'm reminded Viviana last month was talking about this. I don't know, for the people that were there, she referred to it like she asked her audio programmer, what's the budget? And anyway, they define like different levels of their ambience, and it was something like, anyway, depending on the level of capabilities they had, it boiled down to what's the voice limit for all their systems. Okay, so CPU, yeah, how many of these sounds each of these platforms can do? Yeah, we don't show PCM because it's free, let's say, but yeah, that's the big comparison table between ADPCM, Vorbis, and WebOpus for Wise. And the numbers, yeah, don't write them down. As I said, this is available on our website. Yeah, but I found it funny because we have like a brand new Mac, well, brand new, almost new Mac M1 that gives us high numbers, higher than the PC, but it's a 5-year-old i7 PC. Right. So, and this is very artificial numbers. It's not like, this is just the decoder running how many can it do on one core, or how, actually it's how fast can it decode a sound on a core, and then we just extrapolate. So in 1 second, we could do that many. So it's not real numbers. It's really just to give an idea of what's the capabilities between the systems. This table is, well, talks about all kinds of features. So codec platform, does it support hardware decoding or not? Sample accurate looping, sample accurate transitions, variable pitch. But yeah, I got this here for the max count. Because yeah, these are like the numbers of hardware decoding you can do per platform. So Vorbis, a PS5 can do 80. And that's the only platform that has Vorbis hardware decoding. Opus, as you can see, Xbox Series X is the champion in the number of decodes it can do. That's where the Switch and Opus are, I put an asterisk earlier, because it can do 12 to 24. But the maximum depends on, it's like streams is, one channel is one stream. So 6 stereo files, you're starting to get there. Anyway, it's just a consensus that it's a bit limitative. So like I would recommend like below 6 voice, like maybe your music, or anyway, very limited amount of voices that you plan to hardware decode on a Switch, because the capabilities are constraining, I would say. My buddy XMA, and yeah. Yeah, and A-Track is a fun comparison. I like how PlayStation just went, yeah, next generation, we can do double the number of everything. And that brings us to the outro. So I introduced myself and the talk. I talked about memory and CPU. I went through all these subtopics, and we're there at the outro. I do have a final, my favorite quote ever. But yeah, this is the one that drives me to do what I do. Because yeah, it's not just technology. I like technology that works well, because it becomes indistinguishable from magic. And with this, I say thank you. Any questions?